Technology.
All right, you're good. Welcome, welcome. Let's do this again. Miss Joey.
Now, I was just telling them that I had taught for 40 years, about every grade from pre-K to through seniors, and for 40 years. I did 34 years at the middle, and mainly 5th grade. I really liked 5th grade. And I taught American history and English and reading, but history is my passion, what I really love. I'm the president of the Genesee Valley Civil War Roundtable. I'm also the president of the Genesee Area Genealogists. Hey, and after I retired from teaching in 2011, I also became a woman soldier reenactor in the Civil War. And I was telling Jill, so these are period classes, which I was when I reenacted. So I figured I'd pull a lot more for this.
So you can't see us, right?
Right. Now, these are prescription.
Oh, okay.
They're period looking.
Okay.
The first pair I had were actually Civil War ones. And I wore that the first time I reenacted and realized I don't think so, because they weren't my prescription. These are a couple prescriptions ago, so they're not perfect, but I can see you. And I can definitely see this, okay? I do have 2 programs that I do. One I do for kids, which is about schools in the Civil War. I did that for Helen Land Office, last month or the month before. And the boys would sit on one side, and the girls sit on the other side. They have their hands clapped, and we went through the whole thing about when you were called on, you had to stand up and say the teacher's name and then give the answer and then sit down and watch the whole thing. So they really got an idea of what it was like to be in a classroom back then. So what I do is I talk about schools, students, and teachers. The North and the South prior to the Civil War, okay, New England and the North were more devoted to education, much more devoted than the South. Of the nation's 320 public schools, only 30 were in the South. They were more agricultural, they needed the kids on the farms, and so education wasn't as important then. In the South, the sons of the poor were likely to receive no education. No. The rich that owned the plantations, yes, their children would be educated. There was more for the gentry, like I said, and teaching tended to be very private schools. They would go to seminaries, they would go to academies, and most of the education was done not by public schools. As I said, agriculture was important in the North and the South, and it really dictated schedules. That's why we have summer vacation. It's not because the teachers need time off. It's because the kids at that time needed time off. That was harvest. And so they wouldn't be coming to school anyway, so why have it, okay? The school year was approximately 5 months long, commencing after harvest to spring planting. The modern practice of closing school, like I mentioned, it still holds today. People still do that today. By the mid-1800s, children made up more than 1/3 of the U.S. population. Now I know when I do genealogy and I do my family trees, and some of these people had 17 kids, okay? And many of them lived on a farm, and this was some of their way of having extra farmhouse. People had large families, like this one. The schools in the North and education in the South were very different then. Part 1, I'm going to talk a little about the North. Teacher training in the North in the mid-1800s. There wasn't a lot of teacher education. Prior to the 1860s, teachers were hired by each community, okay? States did not license teachers, and teachers were not expected to take any kind of exam, but times started to change. Back in the 1800s, if you were a young girl and you were 14 years old and could read and write, and your parents decided you needed to earn a little money, they would become a teacher. So at age 14, these kids might have a 14-year-old teacher. They didn't have to go to 4 or 5 years of college and all these courses. They just said, I want to be a teacher. And they said, okay, give my kids, I'm going to be a teacher. And so that's the way it was. At the beginning of the 19th century, there were no formal teacher training programs. Like I went to the State University of Oswego, and it's a 4-year program, and then of course you still have to keep going after that. But we had 4 years of intensive training, not only, and your subject matter, about at grade school, but also on how to teach and things like that. In the 1820s, teacher training was offered to what would be high school students only. Once in a while, they would train some of the high school students. Many teachers did train at what they call normal schools in the mid-1800s. It provided courses and subject teachers would be teaching. It trained them how to organize and present lessons. And the first teacher training normal school was in Albany in 1844. As I was telling Jill and some of these people, my mother was a teacher. She graduated from Genesee Normal in 1934. It's the last year of the normal, okay? So the State University started in 1935, but she decided that, 3 years was fine, and she was ready to teach. And as I was telling them, the idea of the old maid school teacher, that was not fiction. Okay? Even my mother and father went together for 7 years, and she said, I don't want to get married because I want to teach. So in 1940, when she got married, in the newspaper it said her contract was null and void because she got married. And then during World War II, they called her back and said, okay, you want to teach now? So it wasn't until World War II that actually women were allowed to be married, because you were supposed to devote your life to teaching. You can say this time, I'm not going to read all this, but normal schools were something that was beginning at this time. And there were about 200 to 400 students in attendance that would go to these colleges. Oswego, that's a college. I happened to graduate, and I found out about the founder of that college when I went back for my 50th reunion, and they did a big program on Sheldon. And I had been there for 5 years, and I never knew all about him, but now I do. The Oswego movement was the Oswego Plan, American education reform movement during the second half of the 19th century. It contributed significantly to this man here. The normal schools associated with that method were founded in 1861 and eventually evolved into Oswego State and other state universities. Before 1860, mostly men were teachers. Okay? That was their career, that is what they were going to do. A female teacher would do it if no man could be found. In other words, we were the second choice. If a man could be found, we'd rather have a man, but if not, well, I guess we'll let the little lady teach. As time goes on, they preferred women. Why did they prefer women? They demanded less pay and did not use it simply as a stepping stone to a better job. Some of the men came for a year or two, and then they moved to a bigger school or district or bigger city where the women tended to live there anyway, and so they would stay. But women were paid less than men in this profession for a very long time. Males were preferred. One reason for preferring men in the earlier schools was the belief that women could not be able to inflict the necessary discipline to maintain order. I'll tell you, in my educational endeavors, I found that the women were much better at this one. I had a partner, and I was the one hand. I was the one that directed everything, made sure they got everything done. He was the good guy. So I don't believe that, but they thought that back then. Expectations for teachers were high. They served not only as instructors, but they were janitors, they were disciplinarian. Many times they didn't have a principal, they had teachers. Okay? So they basically ran the school. They brought in the wood for the fires. If the roof needed repair, they repaired it. They did everything. So it wasn't just teaching. In the North, there were 3 kinds of schools at this time. One-room schoolhouse. Did any of you go to a one-room schoolhouse? Oh, I'll probably be a turtle. Yeah. Even my roommate in college, she went to one. I didn't think they existed in the 50s and the 60s, but they did. Yeah. And I never thought that. I thought they were, I know my mother talked about them. My father went to one in the 20s. And, she went around, I remember when she graduated, her father took her around to the different one-room schools to see if she could get a job. So they had a single teacher in the one-room school. They had 10 to 30 students who ranged in age from 4 to 20. Can you imagine? Oh my goodness. From 4 to 20, and you had to teach them that wide range in the school. They taught reading, writing, history, arithmetic, geography, spelling, and religion. And I remember my father said he went to a one-room school, And he graduated when I was like, they went through 8th grade, and when they went to high school, he graduated when he was like 16. I go, Dad, how come you got graduated so young? He said, well, you know, in 2nd, 3rd grade, I got done with my work and I listened to the next one. And so I reckon, you know, so he just moved through the rows. And you could do that then. You can't do that today. You could do that back then. If you listened and learned what the next grade was, they moved you on it. Rural teachers, usually with under age 25, and the men, and they taught a few years before marrying. And a lot of them, also the women, if they decided to marry, and they didn't have a contract, but they would teach for a few years, the community paid a salary of $3 to $5 a week. Communities collected taxes for salaries, supplies, and upkeep. Some boarded with different families each week as part of their salary. So if you were teaching in a one-room school, this week you would board with Johnny, and the next week you'd board with Kathy's family, and the next week you'd have Jim's family. So they really didn't have an apartment, they didn't have a house, but one of those people, they would live with them and they would feed them for that week, and then they move on to the next one. So that's what life was like for the rural teacher in the 1800s. Now, there were some public schools. They were the big cities, not the little rural areas, the big cities. They were free elementary schools. Money came from lotteries, license fees, taxes, and fines. Sounds like today. By the Civil War, most northern cities had public schools. The big cities, Boston, Philadelphia, you know, Pittsburgh, even like Syracuse, Albany, the bigger towns. They were organized classes into 8 grades in the public schools. 2 separate schools. They had a primary and a grammar. Now I know when my mother graduated from Tennessee, she had primary education. She could do the lower grades. She could go kindergarten to 3rd. Then 4th, 5th, and 6th was considered grammar. And so there were 2 different diplomas. They were grouped according to age. School year longer, only 4 or 5 weeks off. So they pretty much did year round in the north because they didn't have to live on the farms. Exactly as I just said, primaries 1, 1, 2, 4. The boys and the girls studied together. Then, once they got to 5 through 8, they separated the boys and girls. And the boys got different subjects than the girls did because after all, girls weren't smart and could comprehend all these things. Exams were given once or twice a year. And I know at the end of 8th grade, I know my father said he had to take an exam to get into high school. And if you ever want to see something interesting on the net, you can Google it, and 8th grade exam and put a year, 1890. You try to answer those questions. Oh my goodness. Back then, if you got 8th grade education, it was really a good education. And if you went through college, or high school rather, you know, that was fantastic because not too many people, unless they were very rich, went to college. Large brick buildings, hundreds of children, met in large auditoriums. They would meet like in a big auditorium first, and they'd do the pledge to the flag, and they'd have the morning information announcements, and then they would go to their own separate classrooms. Most of the things were due by repetition and oral, and also recitation. They'd get up and you know, talk and recite something, because not everybody had books. There weren't books for everybody. And I know when I was teaching 5th grade, I'd get the Civil War, and I'd talk about Gettysburg Address, and I'd stand up and I'd go, 7 years ago, our forefather brought forth a son, a new nation conceived of liberty, and I'd say the whole Gettysburg Address. How did you know that? I said I learned it in 5th grade, and I don't mean when I taught, and that what I was in 5th grade, and that of course astounded everybody, because even back then, we had, anybody here have to learn the Gettysburg Address beside me? Okay, well I did, and I knew every word of it, because we had to stand up and say it. Each teacher taught a class of 20 to 30 students in that same grade, in public education. Teachers stressed orderliness and strict class schedule. Classes began at 8 or 9 and ran to 3 or 4, which is quite normal. Students were expected to be on time and dressed neatly. Have you seen the kids today? Oh my goodness. And there was dress codes, not only for students, but also for teachers. Attendance was important. They had one of my aunts was actually a truant officer. And they would go, how many have heard of truant officers? Yeah, they go around and check to see why you're not there. I don't think they do that today, but they did then. McGuffey's readers, in fact, I have some, I didn't bring them, but one time I was at an auction, I got 5 of them for $1. Well, they're great, you should see how hard they are too. McGuffey's reader we used to study reading, writing, and spelling, and then advanced readers lessons also had geography and history. Higher grades recited essay by memory. They would learn the whole poem and recite it. Now kids can't believe that today. Arithmetic, there we have the little, we were talking about that earlier with this group here, about the little slates, so I guess this will work on that. Little slate boards, and that's what they did because they didn't have, a lot of schools didn't have paper. They had pencils, but they had the board so they can do the chalk. They would solve problems with the desks, they were raced with a damp cloth, and they'd have contests who could get the answer fast and all that sort of stuff. Penmanship, oh, penmanship. When I first started teaching, we taught cursive, but I think some schools are still starting to go back to that now. Yeah. You know what, for a long time, I know even when I was teaching, I retired in 2011, right, the last 3 or 4 years, we couldn't make them do cursive. Oh, no. They could do whatever they wanted to. They could print or they could do cursive. They were allowed to do whatever. And I also had some of these in my classroom. And my husband made them out of feathers with a ballpoint pen at the end. So they could pretend to write, you know, like that. And then some of them I had the old kind, and you dip it in the well. You can write about 2 letters, and then you dip it in the well again, and you're lucky if it didn't fade away. So this was, you know, this was quite an hard thing to accomplish. They were taught how to hold the paper, how to place the paper, and write precisely formed letters. My mother had beautiful handwriting, the Palmer method. Gorgeous. Correct posture was used while writing. You couldn't slouch in your seat. You had to have your feet firmly on the floor, and it's, you know, a certain way. You had to copy words and phrases, right hand only. She told me a story about her brother, who was 5 years younger than us, who was left-handed, and they would hit him with a ruler. They would put it behind his back and would not let him. And really hurt his education. And this would have been probably in the 1920s, 30s, you know. And so why? I had no idea. Anybody know why they didn't want you to write handed? I had no idea. But they didn't want to. So anyway, typical day. They taught lessons in 15 to 30-minute recitations. They would recite either as a group or an individual. They would repeat memorized lessons, passages, poems. They solved arithmetic problems like on the slates, like they said. They had question and answer sessions. Everything was done orally. They would ask you a question, you stand up and you give the oral response. During noon recess, they ate lunch, and they carried that in a pail or a metal container, and then they played games. And then class would resume. They would play marbles or hoop racing. Sometimes they played football or hopscotch. The 1800s view on education. Children in the rural areas didn't attend regularly, like I said, okay? In the cities, they worked jobs in mills. Of course, there was child labor at that time. And many 9 and 10-year-olds were forced to not go to school, but work in factories to help their families survive. They believed in education, the main purpose of education was so they could learn to read their Bible. And some of them didn't want anything more than that. Once you could read, and if you read your Bible, okay, your education's done, you don't need anything more. Immigrants wanted them to learn English. And back then, I know my grandfather, his parents were from Germany, and they did not speak German in the house. They did not teach him German. They said, you're an American, you have to speak English. And so his parents did broken English, but they spoke English. Although in some cities, school was required by law, but they didn't enforce them. Some had the truant officers, but many of them did not. Okay, so we have one-room schools, we have private, but they also had private academies. This was when the people had the money. Wealthy families, because they charged tuition. They divided the boys into separate, girls into separate classrooms, separate buildings. We had smaller classes, more subjects were taught, like music, art, dancing, foreign languages. So they started to have more of a diversity in what they were teaching. Teachers in a male academy or public school, they planned to make teaching a career. If you were a male teacher in a public school or an academy, and you would teach one age group, you got a salary of $5 to $15 a week. Now remember before, what the girl was making, 2 to 3, they were making $5 to $15. Schools in the North getting involved during the Civil War. Now, the schools decided, okay, we've got to do something for the Civil War effort. Books published and printed during that time would reflect the North, and it had pictures and stories that kind of talked about Lincoln and about the Union. And so they were kind of indoctrinating the kids through their books. Lessons often centered on patriotic songs. They would get together at the beginning. Remember, they were in the auditorium in the beginning. They would sing patriotic songs. They would read assignments and stories about Abe, and they had compositions. They would recite poems. So during the Civil War, education reflected whether they were in the North or in the South by the poems they read, the songs they sang, the things they read. School children marched in parades. They sang patriotic songs. The boys would perform military drills even at school. And some of them even wrote little plays to reenact. They would write letters and send packages to the soldiers. Families and churches gathered to sew clothing. They would knit socks and mittens and prepare food, and that's what the women were supposed to do during the time of the Civil War. Schoolgirls sewed and knitted for the troops. They baked for the troops and sent back to them. They had something called the U.S. Sanitary Commission. They would have big fairs, like we have state fairs, okay? Children had booths that sold these different things that were homemade goods, and then the money would go towards the military. The funds raised went to the commission and to the war effort. They provided medical and food supplies to the troops. So the children were involved during the Civil War in not only their patriotic songs in school, but also in sending funds to help from medical supplies. This was the biggest fundraiser. I thought this was really interesting. Northern children raised $16,000 for the Union, selling this photograph of Abraham Lincoln. Union Army awarded prizes based on the number of photos they sold. And they got so many pennies for each one. Can you imagine the pennies? $16,000. So this picture of Abe Lincoln is probably not one collectors would be going after, because there's probably thousands of them out there. Other schools were created in the North during the Civil War. Orphan schools. Well, you can imagine why there were orphan schools. So thousands, 100,000 men died during the time of the Civil War. Boarding schools for orphans were open in the North. Some widowed mothers couldn't afford to care for their children, so they sent them to the orphanage. They received money from charitable donations and fundraisers. And there were a lot of orphan schools that opened during the time of the Civil War. African American schools started to be opened. They would attend separate schools, but they were established by the blacks or their churches. They received funding. Teachers had classes and run-down buildings. It wasn't equal education, but it was education. If they could afford to send all their children to school, they sent a different one each day. So they had to have somebody home helping out. So one day Johnny would go, next day Susie, so they alternated. Evenings, brothers and sisters taught each other. They said, well, today I learned this poem, so we're going to all learn this poem. And so that's what they do in the evening. Part 2, the South. Education in the South was very, very different. For the wealthy, I'm not going to read all this, but it was a tutor. They would, on the plantation, they would have a tutor come teach their children, okay? And the top wage for a tutor was $400 to $500 a year. Okay, so they were, but they could afford it. They were the plantation owners. The wealthy provided education, full education. Not all were taught by tutors, but a lot of them would just come and, if you've ever read Civil War novels, they'll have the tutor that came to the plantation. Number 2, they did have private schools in the South. Mostly they sent the boys. And students lived in dormitories. Most of them were boys aged 12 to 18. Some held classes for 46 weeks in a year, because again, the wealthy, they didn't have to work the fields or anything, so they could go to the education. And they had schools 7 to 8 hours a day. Every month, they took exams. They rated on their behavior on a scale of 1 to 5. If they didn't do too well, they could be expelled because their parents were paying for these. They had military academies. Some boys were sent to military academy. And as you can see there, they taught a lot of different subjects, okay? They spent an hour a day drilling and target practicing. So during the South, they were preparing their men. And I know when I used to teach the Civil War, one of the advantages in the South was the military. In fact, all these generals, which is really unusual, all these generals from North and South went to the same West Point and graduated. But mainly the South had the highest rating, like Lee and those, and some of the Northern generals were in the bottom of the West, so they really had the best military training. And I think some reason of this is because they were taught right from when they were boys. Girls' education in the South. Some boarding schools offered day classes that lived nearby, and these are the things that they studied: drawing, music, literature, history. They learned dance and singing and maybe foreign languages, needlework, okay, manners and posture. Their education was less academic because their career was going to be somebody's wife and take care of the plantation. They didn't have to know anything else. The poor Southerners, they didn't go to school. There are only a few public schools. Only a few schools held classes a few hours a day during planting season. Excuse me, my allergies are terrible here. The small farmers taught at school. Home, they needed their children again to be on the farms. The Civil War begins. Every time there's a war, things change. Remember I said my mother couldn't teach, and then World War II came and she could? Well, the Civil War did this too. It changed many things. Some men took teaching positions to avoid being drafted into the service. Women showed they were determined, efficient, and very reliable. Once they were teaching there, they go, gee, these women are doing a great job. With many young men enlisted, opening educations were many. So the women started really becoming teachers. And great changed attitude even in the South. Necessity forced many proud and affluent ladies. Some of these plantation owners, of course the South was ravaged. You know, the plantations were disrupted and everything. And so everybody had to pitch in. So many of these, wealthy women, debutantes that normally would be going to balls, decided, gee, I'm going to have to get a job. So they would also teach. Many, of course, of the older families said, oh no, only the poor, less likely they would teach. But they changed their mind out of necessity. The Southern classroom, but in Southern children were to be educated. Someone had to replace the men, so they said, okay, we'll let the women teach. Both North and South experienced change. During the war in the South, the Union takes over the schools, okay? And they opened public schools, required teachers to pledge loyalty to the Union. And if they wouldn't do this, they were out. They checked all school material to make sure that it was, all proper. I don't know if they banned books or not, but they wanted to have the Union side of the story. Northern teachers' loyalty were even questioned. If Northern teachers came down here to the South, they would question their unit. On both sides, high school expectations. Teachers were expected to teach their government views. So in other words, they were teaching the Union view, the United States view. Often teachers refused their pay or fired if they criticized government. It took a lot of tact to teach the peace and answer student questions. Teaching was not easy whether you were taught in the North or the South. Stressful. Many teachers questioned their ability to handle student questions. I think that's still true today. They were distressed to see academic freedom, objectivity, and tolerance disappear from the classroom. This could be now, which I quite often find with some of these that you look at a different view and you think, oh my goodness, I can see something here. I did one the other night and I could see the same thing. Many taught during the war simply for salary, but many chose to teach out of necessity to support their children. Only 2 occupations were open to women in the 1860s. You could teach for $3 a week, or you could work in the field for $2. Which would you rather do? Teach. Even though you didn't make that much more, you know, even though it was stressful, it wasn't physically stressful. The job, they were low salaries, demands, lack of public appreciation, they didn't appreciate them. Many restrictions were placed on them to guard their words and their action. They had to worry about what they said and how they acted. Many were in their mid-teens. Remember, a lot of them were only 14 years old. There's a lot of stress for these young people, okay? In many rural areas, anyone could announce, like I said, I want to teach. They conducted classes in their homes sometimes, or simply enrolling students. They had no certification. The demands exceeded the supply of quality teachers. The need for teacher training really showed up because some 14-year-olds were better than other 14-year-olds. Lack of preparation experience led to frustration. Many of these 14-year-olds could not handle the stress or handle their students, okay? Economic problems, wartime dangers. This was very stressful. Now, I always love this part. These were the rules for a woman teacher if you were teaching in the 1860s. You will not marry during the term of your contract. You are not to keep company with men. You must be home between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. unless attending a school function. You may not travel beyond the city limits unless you have the permission of the chairman of the board. You may not dress in bright colors. You know, it's like very subdued. You must wear at least 2 petticoats. Your dress must not be any shorter than 2 inches above your ankles. And if you notice mine, that. She would have to be able to set the broken leg in a crisis, match the shingles on the school roof, cook lunch on an open fire, wallpaper the residence with newspaper to keep the winter winds out, stay fresh all day from a weekly swim in the creek, teach a class of children aged 5 to 15, ride a horse side saddle 4 miles to school, and maybe carry a couple of students with you. You had to fight off swaggies who attempted to camp in the school. You had to keep the school property free of goats and cattle. And you had to study at night for her end-of-year examination. So if you think, now, teachers get the gab top now, but you didn't have to do any of those things. I mean, they practically, now, you know, we had custodians and janitors, and if you had a problem, you just told them on the phone that we need help. You didn't have to, you know, patch the roof on the school. You didn't have to wallpaper. You didn't have to do all those other things. Duties of the teacher in attending the school. To keep the school neat and clean, you must sweep the floor at least once daily, scrub the floor at least once a week with hot soapy water, clean the blackboards at least once daily, start the fire at 7 a.m. so the school would be warm when the children got there at 8 a.m. So that was the life of a typical teacher. The salary was low. They felt fortunate to have a guaranteed room and board, remember, because they roomed and board with their students. And in the private schools, in the north, they got 600, in the south, 400, if they were private schools. Now, if they were public schools, okay, they might get $25 a month or $50 a month in the north. Salary rose 20% during the war, but the cost of living rose 100%. So it's kind of like, you know, when we say, you know, Social Security went up so many percent, you know, you get $20 more a month but before taxes. It's kind of that idea, okay? Yes, you got more, but. The classroom. The schools were generally small, and often several grade levels were taught in the same room. Tests were often more oral, I said about that, memorizing and reciting and all of that. The curriculum was not as heavy as it is today. A survey of school books from the period indicate their reading books advanced through several modern grade levels in any given year. By the 5th year of school, students were reading material at a level which is today considered college level. Okay. Like I said, high school education was fantastic back then. Student rules. So we learned about what the teacher had to do. I'm going to hear about what the students had to do. Boys and girls shall file in the classroom in separate lines and be seated quietly on opposite sides of the room. Boys shall remove their caps when entering. Children must sit up straight at all times. They must not squirm, fidget, or whine. Children must be clean and tidy in clothing. There will be a daily inspection of your neck, your ears, and fingernails prior to class to ensure cleanliness of person. Young ladies must never show a bare ankle. Girls' and boys' clothing should cover arms and legs completely. So you had to have long sleeves and long for boys and girls. Punishment. This is always interesting. I love to do this one with the students, and they read over the punishments. If you're 5 minutes late in the morning, you get an hour after school. That's for 5 minutes, be late. Double assignments if homework is not done. Nothing shall be dipped into ink wells except pens. I'm sure you heard of that about the guys in the ponytails, you know. Students who are caught writing with their left hand, one ruler wrapped on the knuckles. I mentioned that. Do not speak unless spoken to by the teacher. Talking in class equals one whack with a rod. And this was a rod. This shows a rod here. This shows a rod here. So there was no talking. Nothing shall be thrown in class. Such behavior, 5 whacks. You throw something. Chewing of tobacco or spitting, 7 whacks. Don't chew tobacco. Speaking immoral language was suspension. Speaking, carving on desks or defacing school property, you were expelled. And fighting, lying, or cheating, you were expelled. So only well-mannered children were in school. Kids all at the law. Those are strict rules. But wartime school supplies, scarcity of supplies, they didn't have any books. Like I said, they had to share things. In the South, it was really hard because there was a blockade, and many Confederate Texas were poorly prepared. Changed life in the South. School life changed for Southern children. Many young boys quit school. Many boys became bugle boys or drummers, age 9 or 10. I held the whole program on drummer boys, and they were young. Now, they were not given a rifle or anything. They were not expected to fight. But many times, if you're out in a battle and the guy next to you is dead, and there's a rifle, they would pick it up and they would fight too. So many of them did. Many of them, even though they were required to. Many helped, like I mentioned, in the North, they helped, you know, and in the South, they did scrap cloth. They held fairs, concerts, they sold mittens. So the South did much what the North did as far as having fairs and making mittens and making things and cakes and jellies. And the money, again, they bought Confederate flags, sold clothing, and they gave them to the hospital. So children in both North and South basically did some of the same things. Homeschooling, we think homeschooling's new, right? Oh no, it started during the Civil War. Many schools were closed, so there was no school, okay? So mothers taught. Sometimes they get 2 or 3 kids from the next door and they put them all together and they would teach. They were not qualified to teach and lacked the time many times, but they did what they could. After the war, in 1868, this is one teacher's experience. In 1868, Alice taught at another school. Teachers often moved from school to school. She instructed 40 students in a one-room Vienna Township schoolhouse. Students learned reading, writing, arithmetic, spelling, geography. They had to memorize the facts. Students in the 19th century did not have colorful textbooks, magazines, maps, or computers. Students brought whatever books they had from home. The only supplies found in most classrooms were slates and the blackboard at the front of the room. That was about it. When you think of what we have in our classrooms today, although, I don't know if people realize that, but I know when I retired, I took 90% of my room with me because I bought the textbooks. I didn't take the chairs, the desks, I didn't, but all the novels the kids read, I bought that. All of it, you know, the bookcases, and at that time, VHS tapes, DVD, everything I bought. And so when you think about that today, of what is in a classroom, many times it's provided by the teacher. One teacher's account of her first day. I came to the schoolhouse this morning about 8 o'clock. I built a fire and then proceeded to sweep out the schoolhouse. I found the school very much in want of proper books. Some of the scholars have no books, but a reader or a speller, and no two scholars in school have arithmetic or geography books alike. Scholars she's talking about are students. There's a blackboard about 4 by 2.5, but there's no chalk, nor ever has been any use on it. So there it is, it looks nice, but they couldn't use it because they didn't have chalk. The Board of Education said that it was an advantage to the school for each student to have arithmetic of a different kind and have no teacher, but an incompetent one would be troubled by such a diversity of books. So, it's better not have anything. That just confuses the teacher. Textbooks in the South, again, they were printed, a lot of them in the North. They were Yankee textbooks, and this just shows a picture of it. As I mentioned, educating blacks before, during, and after the war, they started having more. Against the law to teach, I know, I'm sure a lot of you realize that, but it was against the law to teach a black person to read, especially in the 1850s and 1860s, because they thought if they got educated, they might get together and leave, okay? So you keep them ignorant, they can't read signs, they wouldn't know where they were going, and of course they never taught them to swim either, because then they couldn't escape. And so they were not taught to read. Once in a while on a plantation, you would have a plantation lady that said, oh, I'm gonna teach them too with my students. And then sometimes they would be teaching their student on the plantation, and the little girl behind her would be fanning, and while she's fanning during this lesson, she's learning the lesson too. So many of them did it that way. Some of them had large city and secret slave schools where they taught. Education during the War of the Union, many of them educated them by missionary groups and churches in the North would do this. Then they were finally emancipated, and they realized, we got to do something with all these people. What am I going to do with them? We've got to educate them. Many selfless, determined women volunteered to teach during this time. Many of them from the North went down to the South and volunteered in the Freedmen's Bureau to teach the black children. Thousands of contraband flocked to Washington. Was a madhouse. Everybody was flat. Once they were freed, they were all going to Washington. And public schools were established there. In 1864, 13 schools and 23 teachers and 1,200 students were there. In the winter of 1861 and 62, many missionary schools were set up. They got $25 a month plus expenses. After the war, schools were springing up all over. Teachers of both races started to teach, and there were a lot of black women that also would start teaching. And like I said, freedmen schools were set up. Teachers were overworked teaching youngsters. They not only taught the children during the day, but then at night they teach the mothers and fathers. The problem in the South was the plantations were destroyed. There was a lot of bitterness. I think there still is. And they missed their slaves that were doing all the work, and it took more of a century to get all this straightened out. The war changed the teaching profession. Women got a firm hold on the teaching. Thousands continued to enter the field. By 1800, teaching was the second most popular employment for women, second most. 2/3 of the public school teachers were women. So once they got in during the Civil War, they kind of stayed there. And many of the men decided they wanted to do other careers. Many women wanted to escape what one girl called the drudgery of farm work. I don't want to do that, I'll become a teacher. Others wanted to earn money to help support their family's income. But again, women were paid less than men. Here's the timeline. 1860, 25%, 60%, 80%. It kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger as more and more women went into the teaching profession. Rules. I love rules. These are interesting too. These are rules for teachers. Some of them are the same. This was 1872, so this was like the next decade after the Civil War. Teachers each day will fill the lamps and clean the chimneys. Each teacher will bring a bucket of water and serve, make your pens. They made their own pens, those, okay? Men teachers may take one evening each week for out courting purposes. The men could, women couldn't. After 10 hours of school, the teacher may spend the remaining time reading their Bible or other good books. So you spend 10 hours in school, then you can go home and read your Bible. Women teachers who marry or engage in other conduct will be dismissed, and it goes on and on about how they performed. School rules, again, and this, I always use this one when I have students, and they always like this. Obey the elders, speak only when spoken to, idleness is sinful. I have to explain what idleness means. Busy hands make a quiet mouth. Cleanliness is next to godliness. Stand thy body tall to recite. Hold thy tongue when others speak. Honor thy father and mother. Be thankful for life's blessings. Children shall be seen and not heard. Now, I'm sure you've heard a lot of those. And it kind of, there wasn't this big division between church and state at that time, because many of these sound like they got them probably from the Bible. And these were the rules that the parents followed and the school followed. They worked together. If you got in trouble at school, you got twice as much when you went home because you were supposed to be good. Rules for students, I'm not going to go over that. But these are two books that I used. One was on the Union, and they're both children's books. And one was on the South, and what schools were like at that time. They were very similar in many ways. And that's my presentation. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you realize what it was like to be a student back then, what it was like to be a teacher back then. And I know what I do with the student version, I always ask them, what would you rather be, a student back then or a student now? And of course, they all said a student now, of course. And I did this at one of my friends. She was a nun, and she taught Watertown, second graders. I would go in and I'd teach this to them, and I'd ask them the question. And then I'd ask Sister Kathy the question, which would you rather be, a teacher back then or now? So, oh, teacher now, in some ways. So I like the idea of all the wholesome kids, but I didn't want to do the rough and all the other stuff. So, parts of it were good, parts of it were not so good. But education, as we can all say, is much, much different than it is. What is better or not better, I don't know. It's all your perspective, I guess. But today there's so much technology. I mean, even when I retired in 2011, I didn't have a chalkboard. I didn't have a whiteboard. I had a smart board, and I could plug everything from the computer right in the smart board. We did games. I could put movies on there. I could do everything, and it was really nice, right? Then one day it wasn't working. Now you no longer have a blackboard. You no longer have a whiteboard. Anything. And I go, okay. And I said, well, we're going to go back to the 20th century, kids. And I pulled out my overhead projector. We're going to take notes this way. Oh, that's different. And then I said, okay, now we're gonna do study skills today. And I pulled out my film strip and cassette player. Wow, that's pretty. They thought that was the neatest thing going. So I pulled it out because you could show it on the board. So they thought, oh, that was neat. And I said, well, yeah, that's how we used to do it. And they actually kind of liked it. I didn't mind it all. But when you think of it, even from the time I started teaching till the time I retired, things can change immensely. Because when I was in school, college, I had to take a technology course. I had to learn how to thread the reel-to-reel movie, and to show the movies. We had to put it in and run it. That was technology, and how to use an overhead projector, how to run a film strip, that was heavy back when I graduated. And of course, things changed, but it's not some of it's better, but some of it. Well, thank you. I'm glad I hope they enjoyed it.
Yeah.
If there's any questions, I was going to say, are there any questions or comments? Hopefully you'll learn some, and some of them probably was reflective. You probably remember back to maybe something your parents said, or maybe you. You're welcome.
So some of these you guys that were in one-room
Yeah.
schoolhouses was
We had
that?
all houses.
Yeah.
Yeah, all cleaned up.
Yeah, it was very similar, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, she just asked who cleaned the outhouses.
Oh, the teacher.
Oh,
Yeah.
good.
Oh, yeah, they did it all. Of course, this one didn't even mention over that.
No, they
mentioned
didn't.
snow.
Yeah.
But, oh, yeah,
Or
the
hygiene.
outhouse, that was part of your job too. Oh, yes. Of course, a lot of those one-room schools, they would go home for lunch.
Yes.
They didn't mention that, but some of them did go. It's a good, because most of the one-room schools there were lots of them. And so it was within the community that you could walk home. But, oh, yes, my outhouse would be cleaned by the teachers. So, oh, yeah.
I went to a two-room schoolhouse,
Oh, two-room.
and we had running water.
Oh.
Wow.
You were advanced.
And we had somebody come in and,
running water.
some man, and I don't remember who he was, used to start the fire. We had wood stove.
You probably have wood stove.
Yeah, we had wood stove.
Yeah, but it's amazing that they still have that.
But we had an upstairs and a downstairs, that's why ours was a two-room.
Mary, was that in Johnsonburg or?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, wow.
It's a parking lot now for your church.
Yep.
No, well, a couple of weeks ago, I presented Sheldon Historical in the Strikers Dome, and that's the old school.
Yeah, Barbara Lobo and in front of here.
So you went to SUNY Oswego, so Sheldon, that's where I went too. So Sheldon Hall, so was he from
The
Sheldon?
founder.
Yeah, but was he from Sheldon?
No.
Oh.
You know where he was born?
No.
You ready? Perry Center.
Really? There you
Got
go.
a whole program on him too.
Oh.
Yep, he would, and I went to where his parents are buried there. He's not, but
Right.
but it showed, and on you know where Kelly Motors is there?
Yeah.
That's what was the original schoolhouse.
Oh.
That's where it was. And that was the church he went to, the Presbyterian church.
Oh.
And it showed where is, yeah. So that was really very interesting, yes. But he is amazing. I've got a whole program on all the education that he came up with, and oh yeah, he was a forerunner. He went to Europe and studied education over there and came back, and yeah, Oswego was
Yes,
right there. So you went to Oswego.
I went to SUNY.
Oh, wow. For elementary or
No, I went for music.
for what?
For music.
For music, okay. Because it had a lot of different things. Now my niece went there, and now that's more liberal arts and stuff. It's still teaching.
Yes.
Back then, everything was IA is white. Industrial arts teachers were the big thing. I don't even know if they have them anymore. Because they're doing away with shop and all those important things that people don't know how to do. They didn't know how to do. But yeah, and I went back there. It's mostly this, and nothing much has changed. They built the new section when I was there.
Yep.
I was in Hart Hall the year it opened, and then my senior year, they decided in the ultimate wisdom to have a lottery. Normally Cedars got to pick where they wanted to go, not that year. Then I got to go to Cayuga,
Oh.
which was a new section.
Yep.
So I was again in a new section, in a new building. But and we all got split up, which was too bad. But so Oswego was something else. Winter
Was fun because they had the ropes and you had to do the ropes.
and somebody asked, did they really?
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
they did.
I remember doing it because I almost fell.
Oh, well, my freshman year was a blizzard of 66. And they had 102 inches within so many days. And I mean, I know I was in Hart, we used to get evacuated because they were afraid that the wind would take us away or something. And Oswego, and I'm sure that whenever I applied to a school, they looked at, oh, she went to Oswego. She'll make it there, whether we have snow day or not. She went to Oswego.
Just to let everybody know, SUNY Oswego is like, right here's Lake Ontario, and right there's the college.
And
It's right on it.
right on it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And it's right at that, like the little hubbub, and this curve.
When you said Cuba, I was in Onondaga. So yeah.
You were not, some of my friends were not at Ogden. That's a higher one.
That's high one.
But yeah, it was, I mean, I loved it. But, and now, how how we had to walk all the way to, now they have shuttle buses.
Yes, they had them when I went.
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
We
School buses,
Yeah,
I never
we
took them. I
had-
always walk.
we had to walk from Cayuga to Rich Hall, which was like,
Yep, opposite ends.
but a couple times, we got Hart Hall, and I think it was Hart. We didn't have to go to class because the weather was so bad, they didn't think we'd make it. Life with, I gotta tell, I used to tell my kids this too. It's a funny story. I said, I was at a protest. when I was in college. I was in a protest. He said, you were? I said, yeah, I was. You wanna know what I protested for? Yeah, what did you protest? Longer library hours. Because they closed the library, okay? We had a little old lady, she's probably, what, 50, you know, but we thought she was old. And girls had to, like, to go to class, we could be dressed in slacks, and then we had to go back to our dorm to put on a dress or a skirt to go to the library. She wouldn't let you in the door, the girls, without a dress or skirt. So I protested for longer library hours and no dress code. And we won. But no, I wasn't involved in a protest, and the kids all go, really? And then I tell it to them, they go, oh, you know. They thought that was funny, but, you know. But even then, that was in the 60s, and you had a dress code to go along.
Yeah.
You know? Yes, it was.
Where do your Civil War reenact, or what part do you play?
I know a woman soldier, okay, I'm dressed like a man, okay, and I'm with the 1st New York Artillery Company B, Wheeler Banner, which is from the Southern Tier, which is really neat because my name is Wheeler, and we are from Wheeler, New York, and so it was kind of like, and the guy that was my commander was from Wheeler, and but unfortunately today he's older too, and we disbanded. He sold to Hannah. But I used to do reenactments set down Attic Arcade Railroad. Have you been to the Civil War days at Attic Arcade? Well, I was there. In the morning, I usually lived in the north, and sometimes I was in the south. We've changed. And I did Mumford. I did Chilpsburg. I did quite a few different ones. But it was fun. I still go to them, but I don't reenact. And I do programs in my uniform. I know next year I'm going to do some. And I'm doing one on Civil War mascots and pets. I'll call it uniform until I have a version for the school and the version for adults. I gave you the adult version. I have a school version. And so, you know, I still like to do the kids. And I did both of those for Halloween and dogs. Anything else? Well, I hope you've enjoyed it.
Oh, yeah, thanks.
I like to talk and present. I told my husband when I retired, I said, you know, I used to get paid to talk from 8 in the morning till 3, and now you get it for free. I love this.
Thank you.